So this recertification allows us to continue that streamlined process for quicker turnaround, better service, and better consistency from the permit standpoint entirely within Cary. And if there's any questions, we'll bring that forward to the next agenda for the consent agenda if desired for approval.
Pretty much standard operating procedure now. Anybody have any comments on this?
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That'll be on the consent agenda, the January 15th meeting. Moving the meat and potatoes of the meeting tonight is a discussion regarding a unified development ordinance, which we refer to as a UDO. Brian, you want to take it away?
Sure, certainly. Thank you, Mayor, Village Board, and Zoning Board as well. The discussion this evening is specifically to review the proposed draft Unified Development Ordinance. This has been a project that the village has been working on for over a year and a half, almost 2 years, with our consultant, Halsey Levine Associates. We brought on board to assist with the project. Through the last 12 months or so, we've had extensive discussions at the zoning board level and also working with staff and the consultant to update the regulations. I should note that it's not a rewrite of our code, so it's not taking our existing code and throwing it out the window. It's taking that code and updating it in areas that need to be updated, and then restructuring it as well to make sure that regulations are easy to find and follow as a layperson goes through the ordinances and wants to find what the regulations are for their property. So the primary focus of the analysis of this was to look at what are the best practices that are in the area, not just the Village of Cary, but other communities. What do they utilize? What makes sense for the Village of Cary, where Halsey Levine was integral from that standpoint. They've worked in several communities across the country, have done code updates for other communities, and know what has or has not worked in other areas. They provided feedback and direction in that area, and then had multiple discussions with the ZPA to get the code to where it's at this evening. There were certain sections of the code that did require extensive rewrites. There were portions of the code that did not make or sense or were easy to regulate. Landscaping ordinance is one of the specific ones as an example that did not adequately require adequate landscaping to buffer uses from industrial to residential as an example. So those are areas that we updated the code to specifically address development trends or things that have been seen in other communities. A couple of examples of areas that we've simplified the process from a restructuring standpoint. Currently, the code has regulations for fences with where you can place a fence and how tall a fence can be is within our building code. That's being restructured and moved into the Unified Development Ordinance, so it's with other land use regulations. With that, the code was also revised in that area to address variation history. So an example is since 1992, we've had over 69 petitions have been submitted to the village for fence variations or conditional uses in some regards. And of those 69, 66 were approved by the village board. So over 96% of the variations that were applied for were supported. So the code reflects what the boards have supported in the past, makes modifications to reflect those regulations. So those variances aren't required to be submitted for, but still comply with what the board has supported in the past. Similar variation history, looking at lot coverage variations. The lot coverage requirement was established in the code the last time we did a comprehensive update back in the late 90s. For that code requirement, there's been 37 petitions since 1998. 36 have been approved by the village board, so over 97% of those. So some of those areas, the code is modified. There are existing regulations that are still relevant that did not change in this update. So we're continuing to carry those forward. The purpose of tonight's discussion is really to focus on the draft. The consultant, John Housiel and Jackie Wells are here to provide an overview of the methodology as far as how we got to where we're at, and then kind of highlight some of the areas of the code that were tweaked from a regulation standpoint, and then kind of get direction from the joint board this evening for direction moving forward. If after discussion tonight, if the board is on board with the proposed regulations, we're looking to potentially schedule an open house for the end of January so the public can come and view the code modifications, have discussion informally to see how the code modifications might or might not affect their property. And then following that, go through the public hearing process before the ZPA, formal public hearing to review the ordinance and make a recommendation to the village board for eventual adoption. Would envision that if all goes smoothly, that would occur in March or April time period. That would be back before this board for approval and consideration. With that, I'll hand the presentation over to John Hausiel, and he'll kind of go through a PowerPoint presentation that highlights the proposed changes to the ordinance. And then throughout the conversation, if there are questions, feel free to interject, and then both John and his staff and myself will be able to answer and participate in the discussion as well.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.
All right, Mr. Mayor and Board, it's nice to be back here again this evening, and Chairman of the Zoning and Planning Adjustment and member. Glad to be here this evening. Culmination of a lot of work on behalf of really your staff, Brian and his crew, and the ZPA has done just a ton of work over the last year and a half. We do this in a lot of communities, and sometimes it's kind of turnkey where they sort of leave for us to do everything. But every section, every paragraph, every sentence, every word and wordsmithing has been reviewed by Brian and staff, and then again by the zoning board. And over the last, I'd say, year and a half, we've probably met 10 plus times, and it's really reflected in the code that I think is very responsive to the needs of Cary. So what I want to do, can you borrow your clicker? Again, Jackie Wells, so again, John Hausiel with Hausiel Levine. Jackie Wells has been part and parcel of this from the beginning, working hand in hand with Brian and myself and the ZPA. Jackie has in front of her both a clean copy of the UDO, draft UDO, as well as a red line copy. That's the thicker copy. So if you have any questions pop up about what did it used to be and what was it changed to, we've got a red line copy of the entire document. So what I want to do this evening is since no action is being taken, I want to sort of set the table for you and walk you through it. I consider this more of an orientation. Ask any questions, interrupt me if you want, but I'll try to get it all out there, then we can revisit anything in detail. But I want to give you a sense of what we did, what we left alone, and why we did what we did in the UDO. So real quickly, one of the key things of a UDO, a Unified Development Ordinance, as opposed to a zoning ordinance, was to merge the zoning ordinance, the subdivision code, and the sign ordinance and stormwater regulations into one document. It's much more user-friendly. Communities are doing this more and more. And then as opposed to cross-referencing 3 or 4 documents, you have everything in one UDO. We wanted it to align with the comprehensive plan. Again, as most all of you know, we worked with the village to prepare its comprehensive plan a few years ago. One of the most important and immediate actions for most communities to take once a comprehensive plan is adopted is to go back and visit the zoning ordinance and UDO to make sure that it begins to serve as a tool to implement the plan. And that's one of the reasons the timing was such for this ordinance. And then to simplify the ordinance, to organize it, regulations and procedures. Your ordinance wasn't very user-friendly. Some areas were, some areas were not at all. And some development standards and development regulations were severely lacking in what I would say were areas of best practice across the country with regard to landscaping, signage, parking, development regulations, procedures. And we wanted to bring you up to speed with what was being done across the country on a best practice basis. The process undertook these sort of 6 steps, kicked off the project, technical analysis and best practices, where we did a detailed diagnostic of your existing code and a detailed diagnostic from a zoning perspective of all the land use and development in the village. We then started crafting district standards and concepts. Districts are what most people think of when they think of zoning. What am I zoned? What can I do? What can I not do? And how big can my building be? That's most people, that's a zoning ordinance, that's it. That's maybe 20% of the ordinance, but that's what most people think was sort of the heart and soul. The next thing after district standards and concepts, we looked at subdivision regulations. Subdivision regulations, if someone's going to take agricultural land and develop it into a new neighborhood or subdivision, it's different than zoning application on a regular piece of property. Then general development and administrative standards. Aside from district standards, there are what we would call standards of general applicability. I don't care if you're industrial, multifamily, or commercial. If you have a parking lot, how should a parking lot be designed? I don't care if you're commercial or downtown or industrial, if you're going to have a sign, what kind of signage and how should signage be designed? Landscaping, how do you landscape effectively between a non-residential use and a residential use? So there are certain standards that apply regardless of what district you are in. They're standards of general applicability, and we had to revisit all of those for this. Then we looked at your administrative standards. Administrative standards to me are one of the most important. That's the price which things get reviewed and approved or denied. You can ask a resident that has to get a variation, or someone who's coming in for a plan development. Procedure is not clear, if it is cumbersome, if it is onerous, if it doesn't provide the ZPA and the village board with the standards of review that allow them to effectively say, here's what we think and why in terms of findings of fact, then your ordinance is lacking. So we wanted to make sure all those procedures were intact and in place. And then to pull all that together into the draft ordinance. At the beginning, we did outreach. We had workshops for residential areas and invited local architects, local builders, local home builders, as well as residents who live in the neighborhoods to find out just on the residential zoning districts, what were some of the issues. We did the same thing for the commercial and industrial districts. We had a workshop with the ZPA, and then we've had staff meetings along the way. We wanted to make sure that we aligned the zoning ordinance and UDO with the new comprehensive plan to make sure that it sort of echoed the small town feel and delivered what people said was most important to them in terms of character, both in the residential and in the commercial or mixed use areas, to make sure that you had a vibrant downtown that was a landing pad for new investment, but in the character that you were looking for in terms of new development and sustainable development in general. We looked at your downtown zoning to try to make sure that we could accommodate mixed use in appropriate locations. We looked at design and development standards that the comprehensive plan called out to make sure we see if we could codify some of those. Your current PUD ordinance, I'll call this out now. I remember appearing in front of you when the comprehensive plan was adopted, when you were thinking about doing a UDO. And one of the things you're most interested in was the concept of a planned unit development. Your current PUD applies to 40-acre minimums. And most of the development and interest you're seeing right now isn't for 50-acre lots. It's for the little infill lot that has a big impact because it's next to something else. And right now, your PUD ordinance isn't even applicable for the type of development you're seeing most often. So we had to change the PUD ordinance. We'll get into that a little bit later. We took a hard look at your commercial industrial districts, primarily along your key corridors in your downtown, because your zoning wasn't appropriately accommodating contemporary development. And then we wanted to align land use and zoning. And we highlighted the areas that were most out of sync between land use and zoning. The other thing we wanted to take a look at was your structure and clarity. You had some tables in here that were more than 17 pages long. I think you had another one that was 14 pages long. That's a long table to wade through. So, and it was lots of it was because the way the table was structured, it tried to identify every single possible use as opposed to setting up categories of uses. Well, it's impossible to identify every type of use. So we went through and restructured your use tables, your parking tables, your regulation tables. And then there were a lot of your procedures were fairly unclear, that we made sure that those were much cleaner for applicants, for staff to administer, and then for the ZPA and the village board ultimately to preside over it with procedures providing the guidance you needed, because previous procedures were a little bit lacking. One of the key things we did was a nonconformity analysis, and this is crucial for one thing. So what you see up on the screen here, anything that's colored yellow or purple is your R2 zoning district, all right? And in your current zoning district for your R2, you're required to have lots that are 10,890 square feet minimum right now. And everything in purple up there is an existing lot that does not meet the 10,890 square feet. So your zoning ordinance right now, the minimum standard, 60% of the parcels in that district don't even meet your legal standard. And so what that does is it creates what they call a legal nonconformity. And that's sort of a red flag. Realtors don't like it, homeowners don't like it. When you go to refinance, they say, what's this? You're required to have 10,890 square feet. You're only 9,000 square feet. Is this lot legal? Can I do an addition? It's rough. The other thing that it does, if you look back at the history Brian mentioned too on variances or variation requests, if you are a smaller property, let's say you have an 8,000 square foot property, but you're required to have 10,890, your setbacks, your lot coverage, everything else is written for a lot this big, and your lot's not that big. So it's not going to be applied appropriately to you, which is why there's a disproportionate number of relief being sought, because the districts aren't reflective of the neighborhoods that are actually on the ground. So we did a GIS analysis. GIS is Geographic Information Systems, where we ran a query on lot size. So anything right there in purple is less than the required 10,890. So we said, what if the district requirement was 10,000? You can still see almost everything or a huge percentage. So we said, what if it's 9,500? Same thing. What if it's 9,000? Still that. What if it's 8,500? This. So we began to go through and went through all your zoning districts to find out what is the accurate minimum lot area it should be, not to create new neighborhoods, but to accurately accommodate the neighborhoods you've already gotten in a more legally accommodating way. So what we began to do then is draft the ordinance after doing this detailed analysis. So these are the 11 sections that we have: title and intent and purpose, districts, use provisions, development standards, sign ordinance, subdivision regulations, PUD, plan development ordinance, nonconformities, board review, administrative procedures, and definitions. So it's a very easy format to navigate, structured a lot differently than your existing ordinance. Chapter 1, the title, intent, and purpose. As Brian indicated, we didn't change things just for the sake of changing things. This worked, it was well worded, everybody understood it. There was no need to change it, so we did not. Chapter 2 is zoning districts, and I'll try to unpack this a little bit for you. On the left-hand column, what you see there is your existing zoning districts. There are 17 of them. Anything that you see outlined with a brown circle around it, we eliminated those. Anything you see on the right-hand column is our proposed new zoning districts. So we went from 17, I believe, down to 12. Mm-hmm. All right, so we eliminated 5 zoning districts. And so that resulted in some zoning changes, but it wasn't draconian changes. You didn't go from residential to commercial. R1A doesn't exist anymore. We eliminated it. B4 and BP went into other areas that were more accurately reflective of what we were trying to accomplish. And then you had 4 different parks and open space zoning districts, and we collapsed it into 1. So you have 1, and depending on the size and what the use is within the park district, you might have to have a special use or permitted or whatever, but there's no need for 4 separate zoning districts for parks. A lot of communities don't have any. They just let parks exist in any district, but we got it down to 1. So this is the alignment that you see here. So they're originally 17, we got it down to 12. Lot coverage in the R2 and RTA were increased from 35% to 45%. This is a case that I think illustrates what Brian was talking about. And I know I get going quickly. If I go too fast, just tell me to slow down. ZPA is used to this by now.
Yeah, we are.
If you look at the second bullet point, the R2 and R2A, one of the things that people were continually coming in and seeking variations for was lot coverage, put in a patio or something like that, okay? And so what we did is we looked back at the history of what was applied for, what was approved, and that was bumped from 35 to 45%. So it was a 10% increase, but what it does is it accommodates the type of development and improvements to their homes people are routinely asking for, and to be honest, are routinely being approved. So we just changed it. Setbacks in the R3 were reduced from 50 to 30 feet. I think this is interesting. 2 months ago, we were here when someone was seeking relief for a house, and one of the questions that came up was, if we hear our new ordinance in place, would they be seeking this relief? I think they were looking for 3 variations. 2 of them would not even have been needed had this been adopted at the time they came forward. We reorganized the table to permit ease of use and updating the list. So this is your existing zoning map with your 17 different districts. And this is your proposed zoning map with your 12 different districts. I'm going to go through some of the changes and how this represents it. So while there are a lot of changes, again, nobody can, going forward, if you own a home, you can still own your home. Nothing changes. You can still do additions. You can still do investments. Things get better because you're no longer non-conforming. We're not taking privileges or things away from people. We're making it easier to do what you existing can do. And if you have a commercial industrial property, in some cases, you have a little bit more flexibility going forward than less. So our intent from the beginning was not to be restrictive or overly difficult or onerous or overly regulatory. It was just the opposite. To allow appropriate reinvestment easier, to allow a code that could be administered easier by staff and understood more easily by property owners. No offense to any attorney in the room, you shouldn't need an attorney to interpret the zoning ordinance if you're a homeowner. Mm-hmm. So we tried to write it as simply as possible so you don't have to have something explained to you. You should be able to read it and get what you can do with your property. So all the parcels up here you see in blue are parcels that are impacted by rezoning. So these are properties that we're recommending be rezoned. Now, when you first look at this, you're thinking like, wow, that's a lot of properties that you guys are trying to change. Well, first of all, most of the areas up here, the big areas, are parks. Remember, you have 4 park zoning districts. We're collapsing them into 1. So by default, all 4 of those huge park areas are now becoming 1. So technically, those all get colored blue because they're all changing. But they're changing to just another version of park. And then the residential is sometimes being changed from one residential district to another by name. So technically, it's a rezoning, but the uses and dimensions and district standards all stay the same. So it's more of a technical requirement than it is property being changed. So I'll go through these real quickly. These are the parcels that are being rezoned to R1, and there's only one little guy. Yeah, laser pointers don't work on screens. It's the little yellow orange dot right in the middle.
Village Hall.
You see it down there, right?
Okay.
But that's going to be changed to R1. Right now, I believe that's BP. These are parcels that are being rezoned to R2A. And I believe most of these are just R2, correct? So these are all R2 zoned residential properties. And again, they're being rezoned, but they're rezoned in classification from R2A to R2 because the standards change a little bit and therefore the zoning changes, but the use don't, standards don't, nothing else does. But like technically they're changing, so we have to notice them.
And those are the smaller lots that were
Correct.
identified earlier.
They're the ones that,
8,000.
yeah, they're the ones that they're, if left to the larger district, they're non-conforming. They don't meet the minimum standards. And so that non-conforming status is going to appear on any sheet that runs for refinancing or whatever else. This way, the same standards apply, same uses apply, same home occupations apply, same building height applies, but they now conform. So district name changes, but nothing else. These are all the ones that are rezoned to R3. There's a couple of little properties. Some of this is just cleaning up stuff that's already developed. That isn't where it should be. These are parcels that should be rezoned to B2. You can see there's a couple little parcels, mostly the 2 over on the left-hand side. These are parcels that are being rezoned to B3. And there's a handful of small ones. Parcels being rezoned to M. You have a couple of different industrial zoning districts are being rezoned to an M classification. And then you've got this strip along the railroad, which is zoned R2, I believe, and it shouldn't be. So that's being zoned into M. So these are things that are already reflective of industrial use that are being rezoned to reflect what's on the ground. So we're not looking to rezone it so people can't do what they're currently doing in terms of business.
John, can you go back to the B2? And then the next slide, please.
Back.
No, this is,
This one?
that's fine, yeah.
So these parcels are being zoned to B2. They range anywhere from some that are, the blue ones are B, right now, BP, right? Jackie, I can't.
There's BP, B4, and B2.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, we're consolidating into the B3 district. We're not changing what you can do with these properties. So that's a general rule of thumb with most of these rezonings. We're not looking to change what's on the ground. We're looking to change this ordinance to match what's on the ground. Right. I think it's an important distinction. We've worked in some cities that have large industrial areas, and they say going forward, we don't want these to be industrial, so we're going to proactively rezone these commercial. Then all the industrial property owners go, hey, we have industrial zoning. Now you're saying we can't do that. We're not doing that here. Whenever you see a rezoning, it's to better match what's on the ground. This is the one, again, that takes up most of the blue on the map. These are all the park open space zoning areas that are being rezoned to PO. For instance, this one down here, the biggest area, the big triangle at the very bottom, that's a conservation area, but it's zoned residential, okay? So you change that from residential to an open space designation reflective of the conservation area, and it looks like this giant area the village is rezoning. Well, we are, but to sort of codify the fact that it's planned open space. So all the areas you see up there on the map that shows all rezoning areas, you color all these in dark blue, it looks like a big chunk of the village, but we're basically consolidating and reflecting existing open space into an open space. And we have, we put a lot of things in here that weren't in here before, very well addressed. Solar, some wireless, some different language or new updated language for wireless that is not required. One-year tables that I think was 17 pages long or something. And so the challenge of trying to identify every use is that if someone comes up with a use that's not on your delineated list, then it's incumbent upon probably Brian or somebody else, Mr. Attorney, to figure out well, how do we interpret this since it's not on the list? And then you're sort of stuck interpreting it. But if you use sort of a classification system and group them, then it's easier to categorize when people propose something. And if it's not on the list, it slots into a category, it's much easier. So again, easier to know what I can do, easier for staff in the village to administer. We then look at development standards. Development standards, again, I refer to them as standards of general applicability. Landscaping, off-street parking, access or driveways off of public streets to private parking lots, trying to create better standards for these things. Brian had noted landscaping. You had some, if you've got your code in front of you, your existing one, you've got some landscaping graphics that, although we don't say what city we got them from, we use them in other communities to show landscaping standards that need to be revised. They're pretty entertaining diagrams. So we redid all of those and created new standards. And the reason why this is important is this reason. If someone comes in and builds a bank or a drive-through restaurant with drive-through, what standards are that drive-through being held to? If someone's coming in and putting up a new building with a new parking lot next to a neighborhood, what's the required perimeter landscaping screening around that parking lot or around the dumpster enclosure or in the back of the store to the adjacent homes? Right now, you don't address those. And then it's a battle every time, or if they do meet the standards that you do have, because you do have some, we're lacking. They would require a certain type of landscaping spaced so far apart for screening, but a boxwood 8 feet apart with another boxwood's not going to screen anything. So we went through and changed all these standards. And the reason being is seldom does a village get a chance to come in and say, we're going to change all the landscaping village-wide. Well, nobody does that. You change it one project at a time. And whenever a project comes in, you have to create the standard by which that project is held to account. And then you do that incrementally over time to begin to make a big difference, especially in your commercial areas. So standard, chapter 4 is all the new development and design standards. The most important are parking and landscaping. And that's an example of the type of illustration we have in the code that is for drive-through, for screening, for stacking lanes of vehicles, et cetera. That's all illustrated. Chapter 5 is signage. And I won't go into this in detail. We didn't make a lot of changes to some of your sign code, but the reason we had to look at it was because there was a U.S. Supreme Court case in 2016 called Reed v. Gilbert, Arizona, and it was a content-based decision, and basically in the realm of free speech, so sign ordinances couldn't be content-driven regulations. And most sign ordinances across the country, when that gavel came down at the Supreme Court, I'd say 80% of sign ordinances across the country became illegal because most sign ordinances talk about a real estate sign. Well, how do you know it's a real estate sign except for the content? Or a business identification sign. Well, that clearly is driven by the content of the sign. You can't do that. So we had to go through and rewrite standards for size, quality, application, structure, but that it could not be content-driven regulations. So we had to go through and change a lot of your sign ordinance so that it would be constitutionally written. And that's a new thing within the last couple of years. The next thing we looked at was subdivision regulations. There weren't a whole lot of changes here. Some of the changes we made were directly tied back to some of the things the comprehensive plan was trying to achieve, more walkable and friendly neighborhoods and bikeable neighborhoods. So we looked at creating a connectivity index. So you couldn't have new developments going in place that was all cul-de-sacs with one driveway coming out. So you'll see these subdivisions that have all the roads are cul-de-sac, and then there's one road that goes out to the main road. And that's just a choke point. It's horrible. There's no connectivity. You can't walk it. And then the length of blocks we shortened up too, so it'd be more walkable and drivable. So nothing draconian. A lot of your subdivision regulations were just fine, but we tweaked it a little bit. Again, maximum block length, we reduced it to 800 linear feet. I think right now it's 1,500 feet, so it's almost, we reduced it not quite to half of what it was. We put in place a connectivity index, which doesn't mean you can't have cul-de-sacs. You still can. You just can't cul-de-sac every single street in a neighborhood. So we tried to get at some things like that. Sidewalk requirements were added in areas around schools and parks. Not in every area of the village, but if you're within a certain distance, you want to make sure that you have that set walking safe routes to school, walking safe routes to parks. These are the areas that are most active for the youngest of the population that you want to increase safety and walkability. So a few things like that. And then we took a look at minimum roadway widths and right-of-way requirements. We revised them because some of them were a little bit off. And we worked with Public Works to make sure these were all correct. Okay, the next one is the plan unit development or plan development ordinance, and I'll sort of talk about what this is. I remember talking about this with you guys maybe a couple of years ago when the comp plan was wrapping up and we started this project. But a PUD or a plan development, the best way to think about it is to create, establish sort of an envelope, a geographic area upon which or within which a more creative approach development can be had. If you don't have a plan development, people have to come in and have to meet all the zoning regulations or seek a variation, okay? But if someone were to come into the downtown and pick up, say, like the school bus site or whatever in the downtown and wanted to do something really creative, right now that your PUD wouldn't apply because there's a 40-acre minimum to even trigger your existing PD. So they would have to comply with zoning or seek a variation or seek a text amendment. But none of those processes really establish a creative approach to development to get a really good development for that site. So what we did is we created a PD ordinance that allows people to come in and apply and get relief from underlying zoning standards, and in return they give something back to the village in terms of a higher design, maybe public open space, something that otherwise wouldn't come forward. So I'll walk through this real quickly. So it's meant to stimulate creative approaches to development, to provide more efficient use of land, to preserve natural features and open space, to create new approaches to the living environment, and to unify through the code. And I'll go through this. So general provisions for what the trigger is. And what I mean by trigger is, how do I know if I can apply for a plan development, or when do I know I have to apply as a plan development? And the trigger that we came up with was 2 acres. So not including a single family development or single family home. We're talking multifamily, commercial, or industrial. So not single family. And if I have a site that's larger than 2 acres, I have to get it approved as a plan development. That means you come to a public hearing in front of the ZPA make a recommendation, it comes to the village board, okay? And then our standards along the way. So it's a one-stop process, it's real efficient, but then it gives the village the ability to look at things like landscaping, building materials, signage, pedestrian mobility, ingress, egress, as opposed to just having it happen all as of right. If it's less than a 2-acre piece of property, and they meet all the zoning requirements, they can just do it as of right. If it's more than 2 acres, they have to come in and get it approved as a plan development. They do get to do, though, so these are the standards of review. These are all enumerated, it's a long section. Required findings, compliance with the comprehensive plan. Is it for the public welfare? The impact of the proposed development on adjacent properties, impact on public facilities, historical and cultural impact, parking and traffic impact, buffering and screening, performance, appearance, and signage. Now, if someone comes forward, I'll give you this as an example on how it would work. If I'm going to come forward and propose a mixed-use development in the downtown, let's say, as a planned development, 3-acre piece of property. But I want to go 1 or 2 stories higher than the maximum site is allowed. Okay. If it's less than 2 acres, I can come in and build as of right to that maximum height. But if I come in on a bigger piece of property, I can say, oh, it's going to be brick and limestone. It's going to be a public plaza. It's going to be gorgeous. I'll have restaurants and shops on the ground floor with 2 levels of condominiums up above, walking distance to the train station. But I need to go about 15 feet higher than your code allows. But here's my architecture. Here's how it could work. So let's say your code allows a 40-foot height, let's say a 30-foot height, and they want to come in at 42 feet. They would have to ask for a 12-foot allowance. It's like a variation, but it's called a development allowance. And that provides them the ability to ask for relief above the zoning standards. And they're always being measured against the zoning. So if there's a density requirement and they want more, they have to set the standard against what the underlying zoning is. If they want
Something that's higher, they have to say the code allows 30, I want to go to 45, I need a 15-foot
allowance to go higher. Then you have to review it. The reason it's different than a variance or variation is because they don't have to meet the measure of a hardship. If you're coming in for straight zoning on a piece of property, standard piece of property, and you want to go higher than you're allowed to go, more density than you're allowed to go, increased setback from what you're allowed to be at, and it's not a PUD but straight zoning, the only way to do that is either through a text amendment or through a variation, usually a variation. Text amendment would apply to all similarly zoned properties. Variation is just the subject property. If a variation is applied for, it has to meet a hardship standard. And if you have a site that's conforming, even more than conforming, it's often hard to find the grounds for a variation, a hardship. A PUD allows for a creative process. We would like to go higher because it'll allow us to do this, this, and this. It may not be a hardship, but it gives you the flexibility. It gives the village the flexibility to entertain development it might not otherwise be allowed to entertain. So we put in place a PUD process. Again, you have a PUD process right now. The trigger is 40 acres or more. We've revised it, made it better, and now it's applicable to anybody who has a property 2 acres or greater, because that's the type of development you're seeing a lot of. You're not seeing the 40 acres, you're seeing a lot of the 2, 3, 4, 5s, all right? So same idea as what you have, just a newer version of it. It does require that you have a pre-filing conference with staff. You have a pre-filing conference with the board. A person has to come in and say, I'm thinking about applying for a plan development. Here's what I'm thinking. They haven't even paid any money yet. They haven't applied yet, but they're required to let you know what they're thinking. So in a non-binding way, you can say, oh, I think it's a great idea. Density's a little concerned, but I think it's kind of a neat idea. Interested to see where it goes. You might say, I think it's a perfect idea. I'd love to see something like this. Interesting to see how it folds out. You might say, I can't even imagine this here. I'd have a real problem with this. It's a non-binding way for a developer to get some indication before they put any money into it. Do they have a landing pad? Is the table set for them? I mean, is it something even worth pursuing? Non-binding, no detail, concept, brief narrative. They have to meet with the neighbors before they file. Because one of the filing requirements is, did you meet with the neighbors when and what did they say when you proposed your idea? And that way, the first time neighbors aren't hearing about it is at a public hearing. The neighbor and the developer have had a chance to talk. That dialogue and that meeting has to be part of the application requirement. Neighbors love it, but the people who like it the most are the developers, because they don't get sidelined at the public hearing at the podium by hearing something for the first time. The developer can then say, hey, last month we met with the neighbors and they had some really good ideas. They raised about 14 concerns. I think we've nailed about 12 of them. There's a couple that we still have disagreement with, but I think we found common ground on almost everything. And that gives the developer the chance to really make the development better for the neighborhood, and allows the neighbors to talk. So there's a lot of different things that this process does that your existing process does not. We then have to address nonconformities. Nonconformities, the best way to think about this is grandfathered in uses. If it's a nonconformity, you're assuming it's a legal nonconformity. It doesn't mean it's illegal. It means it was legally established and then the code changed. All right? So if I have a piece of property that's been subdivided for 50 years and it's 8,000 square feet and the village comes in and zones my property 10,860, I'm non-conforming. I'm legal, but I don't conform. You have non-conforming uses, you have non-conforming structures, and you have non-conforming uses. So properties, structures, and uses all can be grandfathered in. It means they were legally established. Something changed, they no longer comply, but they're legal because they were there first. And so we have a whole section on nonconformities. Zoning ordinances have to have chapters on nonconformities. You have to address them. We have tried to write an ordinance that minimizes the creation of new nonconformities. In fact, we've written the code standards for the districts to get rid of a lot of the nonconformities you have to make it easier on neighbors or residents. Chapter 9 is the board review section. It talks about the zoning board of appeal, plan commission are going to be revised here on out in the code to be the ZPA. We talk about the procedures, the role of the community development director, the role of the ZPA and the role of the village board and all the different procedures and requirements. 10 is administrative provisions. We talk here, we provide flow charts for all the different application procedures that are required in the ordinance for conditional use permits, for variances, for zoning and map text amendments, and for the PUD process. So all your procedures that require review, approval, application, and public hearing are detailed in here. And then chapter 11 is definitions. Definitions are key because you want to make sure that there's not any ambiguity in definitions. Your existing ordinance had several definitions in the ordinance itself. So you might be reading a standard in the residential section and see something defined that wasn't in the definition section. So we went through the code, and wherever there was a definition, we pulled it out and put everything into the back section, plus added a whole bunch more definitions. A lot of the definitions we also have are graphic. So we will have a text narrative that describes something, but then we also have graphic definitions to go along with to explain anything that we've got visually as well. So when you're talking about building foundation plantings, we talk about and illustrate where this goes, what we're talking about, what the spacing looks like. whether we're talking about parking lot perimeter landscaping, where it is on a site, what it looks like in cross-section view, same thing with parking lot design. Anything that we could illustrate, we did as an illustrative example, but there's also text in there to explain everything. These are your new landscaping standards. So again, these all coincide with detailed text, but sometimes it helps to see what you're talking about. These are all the landscaping areas that are now required for site for commercial properties. All right, we even get into detailing dumpster enclosures. One of the things that neighbors really complain about next to commercial areas. So again, so this gets to then your drive-through facility for screening. But we do that wherever we can, including even for parking standards. So, I mean, we live in a day and age now where everything lives and breathes on the internet, everything. You ought to be able to navigate the code easily, see a picture that explains almost everything, read some simple text and say, okay, I get this. Then they can call Brian. But we want it to be as simple as possible for people to navigate. So I know that's a lot. There's a whole bunch. These are just a whole bunch of graphics that are queued up at the end. That's why I won't have to go through all these. But those are the sections of the code. Our objective was to try to make it more streamlined, user-friendly, efficient, reflective of contemporary best practices from across the country. We tried to make sure that it helped to realize the objectives of the comprehensive plan, but reflective of the character people said they wanted to keep in Cary. We made sure that the new standards don't make it overly restrictive for people's properties, businesses or residential, but in fact made it easier to be a business or a resident here and do what you needed to do for your property without having it be too overly restrictive. And we think all the changes in here make it a more usable and more responsive code to the way Cary is right now. So that's a lot. I know it's a couple hundred pages of text in 20 minutes. So with that, we can open it up to any questions. And again, Brian knows every sentence of this ordinance. So, but it made our job way, way, way better. And I can't tell you how many things were refined at the ZBA level as well. You know, we'd look at it, Jackie would look at it, our graphics guys would look at it, Brian would look at it, and then we'd pull it out to then somebody would be like, well, what about this? Like, oh, good point. We'd make a correction. So a lot of eyes on this, and they really did a great job. So,
Thank you. Any questions from Village Board or Neil? Anything?
I just have a question. Who keeps this book? So does Brian keep it, or is it village administrator, or?
We're going to have it on the website.
Yeah, on the website.
Yep.
Okay.
It'd be part of our codified village code.
Okay.
So it would replace our zoning code, sign code, subdivision code, our existing municipal code.
Okay.
It'll be one chapter of that.
Okay.
Yeah, on file.
most municipalities now, a lot will post it as a searchable PDF, but a lot of them will use Municode, Sterling codifiers. I know you guys have Municode. It's an industry service that takes this once we're done and puts it into web format with the rest of your municipal code as a chapter.
I don't have any questions, but one thing was, would it integrate well with Municode, because that's where people can look it up, and apparently it will. But you did mention a red line copy, which is, yes, the changes. So I would love to get a copy of that, and I'm wondering if we could also put that on the village website so that people could compare and see what the changes are.
Absolutely, yeah.
We can, you probably already have a copy, but we'll get you one without comments on it, because sometimes we would use the comment section for Brian, Jackie, and myself to, go back and forth as we tweak through stuff. But we'll get you a clean red line version to post as well. Sometimes it's helpful to see what was changed and where, but I'll warn you now, you think zoning ordinance is a challenging read when it's a clean copy. You get into a red line copy of a 17-page table, get your best reading specs out, because that's a challenging read.
I'm up to the challenge.
I had a couple questions on the sustainable power, the energy that's coming in right now. A lot of communities are looking at these things pretty hard. I know that we've had a couple solar opportunities. What's the best way that we could regulate that with regards to informing neighbors about it? Because the way this is being written right now, people can come in, they could just get a permit and install these things would they still have to notify their neighbors? How is that all going to work, with the wind and that kind of energy.
And Jackie can correct me, she's got it from me, with solar, they wouldn't have, as long as they complied with the standards, they wouldn't have to come in and get they wouldn't have to notify anybody. It's not a public hearing process per se, because usually the standards are such that they're not going to be an obnoxious thing. There's also a commercial application for solar, which does require permits, correct? So they would have to come in for that. Wind is not as settled a science in terms of regulations as solar is. Solar is a much more easy thing to apply in a zoning ordinance. Wind is a bit more difficult, especially for residential application, because those turbines have to get pretty high up above the house to escape sort of the windy tree, the whirlings, and then you've got the fall zone of something up that high in a residential area. So we don't allow as of right wind turbines in residential districts. Okay. So I've seen communities struggle with that for 2 years and then say, we're just not ready for it, and they back it out. Solar is in here, very detailed. But if I wanted to put solar panels on my roof mounted the way we show, flat with the pitch, I wouldn't have to notify a neighbor. I could do it.
Okay, you'd still have to get a permit for it, though.
You'd still have to get a permit for installation, absolutely.
Well, the reason I bring up wind is when I was a trustee in 2009 or 2010, the Park District, we went through this. Do you remember that whole thing? Yeah. They added, they wanted a windmill and a park, and there was a public outcry. I mean, they're concerned about how this is going to impact. It's a little old farm type thing. I mean, it's kind of quaint the way it is right now, but when we start rolling these things out and people see this, I want to be able to explain them what our expectations are and what our limitations are. But back to the solar, I think, how do we move with this that, for instance, a resident installs solar power and they decide to abandon that? What happens? Should they remove those? Or if a resident moves, who takes over that kind of a thing? How do we regulate that?
I don't think the zoning ordinance right now doesn't comment on if someone leaves and the system is in place on the structure that it has to be removed.
Okay.
It would be regular property maintenance.
Okay.
So
Right. It's going to be exactly. You're going to list it as an item on a contract, right? We know.
Your homeowner, but there's no requirement that they need to remove it. It becomes a property maintenance. It falls into this regulated under a property.
Okay. That's what I needed to know.
And then there's what I went through quickly, but there's an example of building mounted solar, what it would look like. It couldn't cover more than 60% of the area of the roof surface. It had to be flush. It could not extend parallel to and not more than 12 inches above. So about the height of this, laptop,
Sure.
So it would just look like part of the roof.
Right,
Anything that didn't meet this, they'd have
That's
to,
what we've done already, right?
yes. Anything beyond this, they'd have to go to variation, public hearing, notify neighbors, whatever.
Okay. Just double checking.
Yep.
Anybody else have any comments?
Mayor, if I may, I just want to say, first and foremost, on behalf of the ZPA, we want to say thank you to yourself and all of you who are elected officials for giving us the support and the flexibility to pursue this. I think some of you might remember, it wasn't that long ago where we found ourselves embroiled in a ZPA appeal. That doesn't happen too often. And we had council debating the merits of our code and using the elements of style, if I recall that correctly. And so the outcome of that was that we knew right then and there that we needed to review our code, and that's surely been done. And I want to publicly say thank you to John and to Jackie for helping with this, because the key thing that we talked about was best practices. And Mr. Haziel does go around the country and has taken best practices, not only from their areas around here, but from around the country. And I, for one, am grateful.
Thank you.
And I also should say, Mayor, that our friend, Mr. Simmons, has done a tremendous job on the ZPA assisting us. I'm sorry, Brian, yes, Mr. Simmons.
Yeah.
And I want to say publicly, thank you, Brian, for all of your great work. He's a pleasure to work with, Mayor. And we used to work with Mr. Rife back in the day, but duty calls.
Yeah, he's grown up.
I'm always here for you.
Yeah.
Right.
But, and the other thing I would be remiss if I didn't say this is that here we are tonight. I want to say thank you to Mr. Williams. There's two of us here tonight representing the ZPA. You may recall, Mayor, that on or about October the 11th, the ZPA put forward an idea about an associate member, because from time to time, we don't have a quorum. And I'm not sure what happened in that discussion, but here we are tonight. There's two of us represented. The others had conflicts in schedules, which happens around this time of the year, but not too long ago, Mayor, we couldn't convene a meeting because we didn't have enough members. And quite frankly, it was rather embarrassing on behalf of our community. But maybe on a positive note, I think what this does is makes our town easier to do business with.
Agreed.
It creates a framework for economic development, and I think we're going to be in a better position once this gets approved. So our thanks to yourself again, John, for a great job.
Thank you. And again, Mr. Chairman, you and your commission, and Brian, this is an infinitely better document for the participation and thoroughness with which both of you went through this document. I was amazed at meetings late into the night where someone over here on the side of the dais would say, if you turn to page 117, the 18th line down in the table, fourth column over, shouldn't that be this? Because of, I think I go, oh, yeah. So they were reading everything. I was amazed. So it was a job well done.
Amen.
Well, again, thank you to you. It's a great opportunity for us to move our village forward in a positive way. What's exciting for me and for some of the people that participated in our comprehensive planning process, that this is a total fruit of that. And, to hear the input of people throughout the process and, being able to implement these things really shows that we are trying to be forward thinking and get these things taken care of in a real positive way. So, I think we've had a great working relationship with you and your firm. I know you've been around here for a while, considering the time spent doing the comprehensive plan and this. So I don't know, maybe we got to find another project for him to work on. I don't know. But
I would absolutely love it.
who knows? You never know. But we've got some opportunities ahead of us. But
It's been great.
we thank you very much, Jackie. I didn't get to work with you very much, but I worked a lot with John, and it's been a pleasure working with you guys. And we'll take this under advisement right now. We'll get some feedback from the board. We have a couple board members that weren't able to attend tonight, so we want to make sure that they have a full understanding of this too.
Absolutely.
Maybe in the event that they have other questions, would you make yourself available for them to maybe a sit down?
Absolutely. I'm accessible whenever. Yep.
The board members that are absent, that would be great. I think that's
And I'm happy to meet for the board members that are here. Brian and I can sit down with you if you have questions or want to go over this in more detail. I know it was a lot tonight. It's a big document here. It's some complicated stuff too. And so we're happy to review this. The next step, as we had mentioned earlier, as Brian mentioned,
was going to that open house, just giving the opportunity for the public to come in,
meet with Brian, ask questions, get some more of the document. So.
Yeah, to echo what Mr. Rife said, at this point, the key thing is to get it right. And we'll do.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions?
Great job.
Thank you, John.
Absolutely.
Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session, discuss litigation pending or imminent, Illinois 120/2C11.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? We will convene as soon as the boardroom clears.
All right. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you for coming in.
Like I said, if you're a little bit half of it, and I'm like, I have a bug on my